The following document was recovered from the archived records of the Valeth Institute. Its contents have been preserved exactly as they appeared when the investigation was closed. Archive 1. Case File 004. Classification: Genesis. The Norwegian report would have disappeared into the archive if Canada hadn't arrived 4 days later. Looking back, that's probably the only reason anyone remembers it now. Project Genesis was the Valeth Institute's biological research division. Despite the name it would later acquire, Genesis wasn't established to investigate anomalies. Most of its work was routine. Every migration season, research stations around the world forwarded bird counts, breeding records, habitat surveys, and route deviations to the Institute. Most ended with ordinary explanations: weather, disease, or temporary food shortages. By early April, the review board had already processed hundreds of reports. The Norwegian file was simply another entry on an ever-growing list. It described a flock of pink-footed geese that had abandoned their established migration route for just under 2 hours before correcting their course and continuing south. Scientists examined the weather, predators, aircraft activity, and magnetic conditions. None explained the deviation. Since every bird reached its destination and the migration continued normally, the report was dismissed that same afternoon. No one questioned the decision. The second report appeared just as ordinary. Rangers tracking woodland caribou in northern Canada recorded that the herd had wandered nearly 23 miles away from a migration corridor they had followed for decades. They neither scattered nor accelerated, maintaining the same pace before quietly rejoining their usual route. The incident was logged as a minor curiosity. The field biologist made no attempt to explain the detour. Instead, he added a handwritten note in the margin, remarking that the behavior reminded him of an event reported from Norway earlier that week. That single sentence was enough for the Institute to reopen the Norwegian report on March 22, 2026. Project Genesis was asked to review both files together. Migration had never been an exact science, and 2 reports from different continents involving unrelated species were hardly enough to justify a formal investigation. The files were set aside simply because comparing them required little effort, and everyone assumed the review would end there. It didn't. Before the review board had finished comparing the first 2 reports, a third arrived from a marine research vessel east of Japan. Researchers studying a tagged pod of Pacific white-sided dolphins watched the animals leave their migration route without any identifiable cause. Ocean conditions were stable, commercial shipping was absent, and the hydrophone recordings were reviewed twice. Nothing explained the change. For 83 minutes, the dolphins maintained a steady northern heading before returning to their migration route. The remainder of the migration unfolded exactly as expected. For the first time, a report remained on the review board's desk instead of being transferred to the archive. The comparison was assigned to a doctoral researcher developing predictive models for migratory behavior. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Species, geography, climate, and feeding patterns were compared against historical data, and every result fell within expected limits. By late afternoon, she had almost finished her summary when one question occurred to her. Instead of comparing the migrations as a whole, she isolated only the brief periods during which each species had abandoned its normal route. The calculations were repeated before reaching the review board. A second researcher independently analyzed the data and arrived at the same conclusion. The geese, the caribou, and the dolphins had all traveled in roughly the same direction during their deviations.
One researcher suggested coincidence. Another argued that 3 observations were statistically meaningless. No one disagreed. If there really was a pattern, more evidence would expose it. Project Genesis sent a request to every organization contributing migration data to the Institute, asking for any recorded migration deviation, regardless of species or location, observed during the previous 6 months. The request was sent that afternoon. 6 days later, 37 reports were waiting on the review board's desk.
Most of those reports were already gone by lunch. Some of the reports had involved migratory shifts that could be explained away by storms. Others were tied to wildfires, odd temperature shifts, or habitat invasions. A few just didn't have enough information to be properly assessed. By the end of the day, there were 11 reports, 11 species, 4 continents. Project Genesis expected this, that they could already be seeing anomalies when the evidence was still trickling in. What they hadn't anticipated was that these deviations would only become more prevalent as time went on. The shifts in migration patterns were all over the place. Some took place within minutes, while others lasted for hours. They ranged from just under a mile to nearly 40. Birds scattered across clear skies. Marine mammals veered off course to the deep water. Entire herds of beasts turned on the spot so their procession was reversed. Monarch butterflies, terns, elephant seals, even fruit bats were added to the growing list. There was clearly something provoking this. Whatever it was, it didn't show any preference towards a particular creature. Not any obvious link between the animals that went rogue at the same time. The review board spent 3 days on it, combing through all possible environmental conditions. They checked weather patterns and geomagnetic fluctuations, ruled out solar storms, predator invasions, shifting pressures within the atmosphere, man-made interference. They even looked at natural disasters. All were thrown out by the end of it all, and the hunt was stalled until one of them got the brilliant idea to pin all the reports up at once. The migration reports had been kept separate from everything else and pinned up at the side with the other satellite data. It took a while for the others to see it for what it was. At first, there wasn't anything there. No obvious reason why any of these patterns should overlap each other. Then one of them took a step back and saw what the others had missed. The deviations weren't random, but they all favored a specific region: the Eastern Himalayas. There was a long silence as the review board took this in. They'd been looking for a reason, for an obvious cause behind all of this. Instead, they'd found something else completely: a location. The Institute requested every survey, geological and otherwise, that covered the region the next day. The results came in during the afternoon. Nothing extraordinary stood out from the search. No military installations, research facilities, unusual geomagnetic readings, seismic disturbances. It was a relatively common landmark that was unremarkable save for its lack of fame. There wasn't even a name for it on some state-sponsored charts. The researchers took it upon themselves to ask the final question, as the others were too afraid of what the answer might be. If nothing is there... He let the sentence hang for a moment before finishing it. Why does everything keep pointing toward it? No one answered. Later that afternoon, a request was forwarded to archive services. The Institute wanted to know whether the valley had ever appeared in its records before. Archive services uncovered the mystery before the end of the day. As far as the review board was concerned, this was completely normal. Research divisions would often ask if a certain location, material, or phenomenon had been encountered before. And most of the time, it turned out to be little more than a stray report or survey buried in the Institute's archives. The unnamed Himalayan valley was no different, and if anything had been found there before, The review board was reasonably certain that it would turn out to be little more than a stray mention. The digital catalogs bore this out. The valley was an isolated region surrounded by high mountains and covered in heavy forest. The rock formations were normal, save for the occasional trace mineral, and the water sources were little more than glacial streams, behaving exactly as one would expect from mountainous terrain. Ecological reports found no abnormality in the region either, save for the obvious presence of a Himalayan ecosystem. There were no military installations, research facilities, magnetic anomalies, or seismic instabilities. The valley was completely normal, save for the obvious presence of a Himalayan ecosystem. There was nothing special about the region, and certainly nothing that would warrant attention from the Institute of Advanced Sciences. Ordinarily, Archive Services had another division which kept another set of catalogs. This division dealt in older reports, some of which had not been digitized for archival purposes and were stored in physical form in another part of the facility. It took longer to search through them, as they could not be accessed remotely, but these catalogs had a reputation for providing answers when the Institute's computers were unable to. The first relevant finding turned up just before midnight. It was not what the review board had been expecting, however. This was not a survey or a report on the valley's geology or ecology, but rather an inventory card describing an investigation conducted 28 years ago, which was canceled before completion. No reason for this cancellation was given, and the catalogs contained no information on what the investigation's findings might have been. The file itself had been removed from Archive 1, and all that remained were the reference number and the date of its removal. The review board continued searching, and the second relevant find was even more surprising. It was a survey written in 18th century script, which described a failed expedition. The problem they had encountered, it seemed, was that no two measurements ever matched. The distances between landmarks varied with every expedition. Compass bearings failed to agree with one another, and even repeated attempts at drawing the valley produced inconsistent results. This was despite all of the instruments used being checked and found to be in working order, and despite no changes were noticed in the valley itself. The author of the survey made no assumptions as to the cause of these discrepancies, save for one. It was he who suggested that perhaps the instruments used to measure the valley were somehow faulty, even if he had no reason to believe this was the case. It turned out not to be the case. The later reports and surveys continued the pattern. One 19th century geological survey found that elevation measurements taken from the same reference point produced differing results every morning. And a military expedition several decades later gave up on mapping the region after several attempts at triangulation failed to produce consistent results. None of these expeditions used the same instruments, nor did they take the same approach, nor did they even have the same goals, and yet they all encountered the same problem. The valley was behaving completely normally, as far as anyone could tell. It was the measurements that failed every time, without fail. By the time Archive Services delivered its report, the review board's copies of migration reports were nearly buried beneath piles of old surveys. 3 days ago, Project Genesis had begun as an investigation into an anomaly. Now, however, it seemed that the only reason the migrations were noteworthy was because they were the first sign that something was happening in this region. This, more than anything else, changed the nature of their search. The review board no longer spent its time asking what the cause of the migrations might have been, because the evidence was beginning to suggest that there was something happening in this valley long before Project Genesis had taken notice. This something had caused problems for cartographers, geologists, surveyors, and explorers, and now it was interfering with wildlife. Different expeditions had encountered different effects, but they had all been present in this valley. And now, it was time for the review board to see what they had seen before. The last report turned out not to be a survey, an expedition log, or even a research journal. It was a simple transfer notice, bearing the seal of the Institute. It listed all of the reports that had been found in this valley over the course of the last 2 centuries, and it noted that all of them had been transferred to another archive at the behest of the review board. This transfer had apparently taken place several times, and the instructions for it had never been rescinded. The single location listed at the bottom of the page was as follows: Archive 0. It took several long moments for anyone to say anything at all. The review board had spent the last week under the impression that they were the first people to have discovered the valley's mystery. The archive, however, contained evidence that suggested otherwise. Long before Project Genesis had been founded, long before the Institute had even been granted access to satellite imagery and modern surveying equipment, there had been people searching for answers. These people had followed the same procedures as the review board, and they had reached the same dead end, and they had transferred all of their findings to an archive that most people inside the Institute had never even known existed. The valley's mystery had never been forgotten. It had been hidden. The discovery of Archive 0 became the first real breakthrough of the investigation, succeeding where every migration report had failed. Until then, Project Genesis had assumed it was documenting a newly emerging phenomenon whose effects merely happened to cross international boundaries. Every conclusion had followed naturally from that assumption. The migration deviations led to the valley led to forgotten investigations, and those investigations eventually led to Archive 0, where the trail appeared to end. Only after the surviving records had been arranged chronologically did the review board recognize the flaw in that reasoning. They had assumed the valley was the destination of every investigation. The historical records suggested otherwise. Each expedition had approached it from an entirely different direction. Some had been investigating unusual astronomical observations, others unexplained geological inconsistencies, faulty surveying equipment, or unrelated ecological disturbances. None had set out looking for the valley, yet every one of them eventually arrived there before abandoning the investigation without ever understanding what they had actually found. That realization changed the meaning of Archive 0. Its contents weren't organized by subject, discipline, or geography, as anyone might expect. Geology sat beside astronomy. Ecological studies shared shelves with equipment failure reports, while 19th century travel journals appeared alongside modern observational data. Read individually, the files had almost nothing in common. Read together, they described fragments of the same recurring phenomenon, observed by generations of researchers who never realized they were investigating different parts of the same mystery. The review board spent the following week reconstructing that history from the fragments left behind in Archive 1. Most of the original reports had disappeared decades earlier, but correspondence between researchers, catalog cards, and transfer records had survived the purge that accompanied their relocation. They revealed very little about the phenomenon itself, but they explained why so many investigations had failed. Nearly every major expedition associated with the valley entered the archive at intervals of approximately 28 years. Several members of the review board dismissed the pattern as an illusion created by incomplete historical records, but the interval remained consistent as more documents were recovered. Before long, nobody could ignore it. The realization was unsettling because the same span of time had appeared elsewhere in the Institute's history. Project Genesis lacked the clearance to examine those restricted records, yet everyone present understood the implication well enough to request a formal review of Archive 0. The response arrived the following afternoon. Access to the case files was denied, but the review board was granted supervised access to the Archive 0 transfer register instead. It was an unusual compromise, suggesting that someone outside Project Genesis had already reached the same conclusion.
Most of the register was administrative, until the oldest surviving entry appeared. Unlike every document that followed, it listed no originating department, no investigator, and no geographical coordinates. In the space where later records identified the valley, only 2 handwritten words remained. First observation. It was the only entry of its kind. Every later file described an observation of an existing phenomenon. This one appeared to document the moment the phenomenon itself had first entered the Institute's records. The original case file no longer existed. Whatever evidence had accompanied it had disappeared into Archive 0 long before the modern archive was established. Only a final annotation survived beneath the catalog entry, written decades later by an unknown hand. Subsequent investigations indicate that the valley is not the origin of the phenomenon. It is the first location at which the phenomenon becomes observable. The room fell silent. For more than 2 centuries, every investigation had failed for exactly the same reason. The evidence always pointed toward the valley, encouraging each expedition to mistake it for the source of the phenomenon, when it was only the first place where its effects became visible. Case File 004 was officially closed on April 18, 2026, with a recommendation that responsibility for the valley be transferred from Project Genesis to Project Echo. The migration anomalies had proved to be only secondary effects of a phenomenon that extended well beyond the biological sciences.
A handwritten note, never included in the official findings, occupied the final page of the report. If the valley is only the first place where reality becomes measurable in another state, then somewhere beyond it there must be a point where that state begins. In later Institute records, that point would be known simply as the origin. While Project Genesis closed its investigation into the migration anomalies, Archive Services continued reviewing the transfer records recovered from Archive 0. Among the oldest catalog entries was a survey photograph dated April 1998. The photograph should not have existed. It showed the valley exactly as modern satellite imagery recorded it. There was only one difference. Standing at the center of the valley was a stone structure that had never appeared on any map, expedition journal, or aerial survey before or since. The reverse side of the photograph contained 6 handwritten words. Do not let them reach it. The signature had almost disappeared with age. Only one letter remained legible.